Some stories don't start with a bang. They start with the quiet hum of a coffee machine and the creak of an old wooden chair. In a small town where the mornings were slow and the conversation slower, there was a table in the corner everyone knew: the coffee club. 4 friends who had seen enough of life to know when something wasn't right. They weren't heroes in uniform. They weren't politicians. Just ordinary people with sharp eyes and sharper instincts that fall morning. The air outside was crisp, leaves tumbling down Main Street, but inside the coffee shop, a storm was brewing. It began when the door swung open and a man with a smirk you could hear before you saw stepped in. His name was Travis Kane, and in his wake came a shadow that would threaten the heart of the town itself. This is the story of how 4 friends, led by an old mailman with more wisdom than most men twice his age, stood their ground against money, power, and fear, and it all began with a single moment when the room went quiet, and the old mailman cleared his throat. Before we begin, I want to know something from you. Where in the world are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments. I read everyone. Now, let's step inside that coffee shop and see how it all unfolded. The coffee shop smelled like fresh cinnamon rolls and roasted beans, the kind of scent that hugged you before the door even finished swinging closed. Outside, autumn leaves swirled in little tornadoes, scattering across Main Street. Inside was quiet except for the soft hum of the espresso machine and the low murmur of the regulars, who always gathered at the corner table. They called themselves the Coffee Club, a name half-jokingly written in chalk on a small sign by their table. There was Maggie, the retired schoolteacher with sharp eyes and softer words. Henry, a Korean War veteran whose stories could quiet. A whole room Grace, the librarian who spoke gently but remembered everything. And of course, there was the mailman, Arthur Hayes, 72 years old, his hair silver and his uniform neatly pressed even in retirement. He had a slow walk, a quiet voice, and a habit of listening more than he spoke. This morning it started like any other, until the bell above the coffee shop door jingled, and a voice sliced through the calm like a knife through silk. In walked Travis Kane, 30 years old, big-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket that creaked when he moved. He had the kind of smirk that made you brace for what was coming. Travis had been trouble in this town for as long as most could remember. His father had owned half the land in the county. His mother had been a beauty queen, and somewhere between privilege and neglect, Travis had learned that fear was easier to earn than respect. He had a way of making every room smaller when he entered. Today, he didn't head for the counter. He walked straight to the front, turned around, and leaned against the old piano near the window. His voice carried without effort, "You people don't know the real story about what's coming to this town," he said, his grin widening. "You think the new development is going to bring jobs, money, progress? No, it's going to bring something else, something you're not ready for." The coffee club fell silent, not because they believed him, but because they knew Travis didn't speak unless he wanted something. And when Travis wanted something, it usually came at someone else's expense. Maggie's hands curled around her mug. Grace glanced at Henry, who was staring hard at Travis. Arthur sat still, eyes half-shadowed under the brim of his old cap. The bully was enjoying the attention, letting his words drip slow like syrup. "You see," Travis went on, pacing now, "there's a deal on the table, and not everyone in this room's going to like who gets the upper hand, but me. I know how to make sure I come out on top." It was then that Arthur shifted in his seat, the wooden chair creaking under his weight. He didn't speak, not yet, but Maggie noticed the way his fingers tapped slowly on the table, like he was counting. Something only he knew. Outside, the wind rattled the window, leaves brushing against the glass. Inside, tension thickened like the steam from the coffee machine. Travis laughed to himself, certain the room was his. Arthur's eyes lifted, meeting Travis's for the first time, and though his lips didn't move, something in that steady gaze hinted that the old mailman knew more than anyone else in the room. Travis leaned an elbow on the piano and tilted his head like a man who owned the air. Everyone was breathing. He looked at the faces staring back. At him, the guarded eyes, the pursed lips, the way some people wouldn't meet his gaze. It fed him. "You've all been sipping coffee and pretending you still run this town," he said, his voice dropping lower. "But the truth is, the power's shifting. And I'm holding the strings." A few customers shifted uncomfortably. Sam the barista froze mid-pour, watching him. Even the ticking clock above the pastry case seemed louder. Henry cleared his throat, but Travis steamrolled over the sound. "There's land changing hands, prime land, and once the ink dries, there's no going back. A man like me sees opportunity. A man like me knows how to turn that into real money." Maggie frowned, her mind already flipping through her mental filing cabinet of local news and property records. Grace's hands stayed folded in her lap, but her knuckles whitened. Arthur still hadn't spoken. He had been a mailman for 40 years, and in those years he had learned that most people gave away their truths in how they carried themselves. Travis's voice was confident, but Arthur saw it. The way his shoulders tightened, the way his eyes darted ever so slightly when he mentioned the land. This wasn't just bluster. There was a plan in motion. "You're going to destroy what's left of the community," Henry finally said, his voice deep and steady. Travis grinned. "Community?" "Henry, community doesn't pay bills. Community doesn't get you new roads, new buildings, new life. What I'm bringing is the future." "You mean you're selling it off, piece by piece?" Maggie shot back, surprising even herself. Travis's smile faded just enough to reveal a flicker of irritation. "Careful, Maggie. You've always been smart. Don't make me think otherwise." The tension was a live wire now, crackling between them. Sam set down the coffee pot, ready to step in if things got too sharp. Arthur's fingers stopped tapping. His chair shifted an inch. The coffee club knew that movement. The prelude to when Arthur decided a conversation had gone on long enough. He looked around the table at Maggie, Grace, Henry, and then back at Travis when he finally spoke. His voice was calm but carried weight. "Funny thing about strings, Travis," he said. "They break when you pull too hard." The words hung there, not loud, not threatening, but firm enough to cut through Travis's smirk. The old mailman hadn't raised his voice, yet somehow it felt like the entire room had leaned toward him, waiting. Travis stared at Arthur for a moment longer, then chuckled and shook his head. "Always the wise one, huh, Hayes? We'll see just how much wisdom matters when the real game starts." And with that, he pushed off the piano, heading toward the door. But the coffee club knew this wasn't over. It had only just begun. Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes following Travis until the door swung shut and the wind rushed in. The sound of the bell lingered like an unwelcome echo. The moment Travis stepped outside, the warmth in the coffee shop felt thinner, like a draft had slipped through the cracks. The coffee club sat in silence for a few seconds, the clinking of spoons and cups now sounding louder than before. Maggie was the first to speak. "He's up to something big. I could see it in the way he wouldn't stop circling back to the land." Henry grunted, leaning back in his chair. "I don't need to see it. I can smell it. That boy's been trouble since he could walk, and now he's got just enough money and just enough charm to make people ignore the stink." Grace adjusted her glasses, her voice soft but sharp. "It's not just charm, it's leverage. He must have something that makes the town's decision-makers listen." Arthur set his cup down, his movements deliberate. "He's talking about land that's been in the heart of this community for generations. If it changes hands, it won't just be property. It'll be power. Once it's gone, you don't get it back." Sam leaned on the counter, joining the conversation. "You think it's the old Miller estate? They've been fighting over that property for years." Arthur's gaze didn't leave the table. "Could be, but it might be bigger. Something tied to the rail spur on the edge of town. Developers have been sniffing around that for a while." Maggie's lips pressed into a thin line. "If it's the rail spur, that means warehouses, factories, and the end of half the small businesses on Main Street." Henry's jaw tightened, And if the coffee club's right, Travis won't stop at buying a piece of it. He'll try to control the whole thing. Arthur stood slowly, adjusting his cap. Then we'd better find out exactly which strings he thinks he's holding, and who's letting him hold them. The others exchanged glances. It wasn't often that Arthur volunteered to step into the middle of things. His usual role was to observe, to guide gently. But when he decided to act, it meant the situation was past the point of waiting. "I still know people at the post office," Arthur said, "and people still talk when they don't. Think anyone's listening? I'll start there, Maggie. See if you can dig up any council meeting notes or zoning applications. Grace, check the archives at the library. Henry, talk to the veterans group. You'd be surprised what they hear through the grapevine." Henry's mouth curved into a rare smile. "Sounds like we're going back to work." Arthur picked up his coffee and took one last slow sip before heading to the door. We don't let someone like Travis decide the future of this town without a fight. Outside, the wind caught the door and pushed it wide open. Arthur stepped into the crisp air, the brim of his cap casting a shadow over his determined eyes. The old mailman was moving again, and when he moved, things happened. Arthur walked down Main Street with the same steady gait he had used for decades, delivering letters rain or shine. But now there was no satchel over his shoulder, only the weight of knowing the town he had walked through for half his life might soon belong to someone who saw it as nothing more than a ledger of profit. He started at the old post office. The building smelled faintly of paper and dust, the way it always had. Behind the counter was Marlene, a woman with a voice like warm honey and an unmatched memory for names and addresses. "Arthur Hayes," she said with a grin. "Didn't expect to see you in here, unless you were picking up a package of those oatmeal cookies from your sister again." Arthur smiled faintly, leaning on the counter. "Not today, Marlene. I'm looking for information, the kind you get when you've been here long enough to see patterns in the mail. You seen any new names on bulk deliveries, contracts, or business registrations lately?" Marlene's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're not talking about junk mail, are you?" "No," Arthur replied. "I'm talking about developers, land buyers, anyone sending more paperwork than a small town like ours can swallow." She hesitated, then glanced over her shoulder. "There's been a flurry of certified letters going through here, all tied to an LLC with an out-of-state address. Funny thing is, a few of them went to the county clerk's office, and the rest to a law firm 2 towns over." Arthur nodded. "Name of the LLC?" "Silver Creek Holdings," she whispered, as though speaking it too loudly might summon something unwelcome. Arthur thanked her and moved on. He stopped by the hardware store next, where Walt, the owner, had been repairing hinges behind the counter. Walt had always been good at listening without looking like he was listening. "Anyone asking about supplies for large-scale construction lately?" Arthur asked. Walt shrugged. "Had a guy last week asking about fencing materials. Big orders, said he was working for a new client, but wouldn't say who. He paid in cash." The picture was starting to form in Arthur's mind, but it wasn't enough. Yet he needed to see where the threads met. By afternoon, he was at the train depot on the edge of town. The freight supervisor, Joe, greeted him with a handshake. "Haven't seen you in a while, Arthur. Still keeping tabs on us?" Arthur gave a small smile. "Always, Joe, always." Joe leaned against the railing. "We've had a few unusual shipments lately. Heavy equipment, foundation forms, industrial generators. Came in under the name Silver Creek Holdings." Arthur's jaw tightened just slightly. That name again. Always just far enough in the shadows to avoid casual notice. As the sun dipped low, Arthur made his way back to the coffee shop. The others were already there. Maggie with her notes from the council office. Grace with a folder of maps and old property records. Henry with a list of names from the veterans group who had heard whispers about a buyout. Arthur set his cap on the table. "It's Silver Creek Holdings, and they're moving faster than we thought." The coffee club leaned in as Arthur explained what he'd found. The tension at the table was heavy, but there was something else beneath it now, a spark of a plan beginning to form. Asterisk Maggie flipped open her notebook, the pages covered in. Her precise handwriting. I checked the council minutes from the past 6 months. Silver Creek Holdings has never been mentioned in open session. Not once. But there are closed-door meetings that happen right after the official adjournments. And the same names show up every time. Councilman Drew Porter, Mayor Finch, and that attorney from Milltown, Carl Diensmore. Grace leaned forward, laying out the old property maps she had dug up. This is where it gets interesting. The rail spur and the Miller estate both border an unused tract that was part of the old lumber yard. It's been sitting empty for 20 years. No one's touched it because it's contaminated from the old processing plant. But if someone cleans it up, its value skyrockets. Henry frowned. And let me guess, Silver Creek Holdings isn't scared of a little dirt. Arthur nodded. Not if it means flipping it for 10 times what they paid. Maggie tapped her pen against the table. So here's where Travis fits in. He's not a developer. He's a broker, someone who makes connections between people who have the land and people who have the money. And given his history, he's probably taking a big cut for keeping things quiet until the deal's done. Grace's voice was calm but carried weight. And once the deal is done, Main Street changes forever. We're talking chain stores, industrial buildings, no charm, no history. Henry's fists tightened on the table. We've seen this before. Small towns get hollowed out while a handful of people get rich. Arthur's gaze moved from face to face. Then we need to make sure this deal never gets to the finish line. They began to sketch out a plan right there at the coffee shop. Each person bringing their own skill to the table. Maggie would track the political trail. Grace would dig for the legal loopholes. Henry would quietly rally the veterans. And Arthur would follow the mail. Because if there was one thing he knew, it was that paper trails had a way of betraying the people who thought they were untouchable. Sam came over with a fresh pot of coffee, lowering his voice. If you're going after Travis, you better be careful. He's got a temper, and he doesn't mind using it. Arthur gave a faint smile. I've walked icy roads in February, with the wind at my back and dogs chasing at my heels. Travis Kane doesn't scare me. The coffee club leaned closer as Arthur lowered his voice. The trick isn't to fight him head on. The trick is to make him show his hand before he's ready. And somewhere deep in his mind, Arthur was all ready, thinking of the exact moment he would clear his throat and change everything. Asterisk Arthur's plan began the way most of his routes had started. With quiet steps and a watchful eye, he knew that men like Travis thrived in shadows, where deals could be whispered over handshakes and sealed without anyone seeing the ink dry. If you wanted to stop them, you didn't run in shouting. You made them believe the ground was solid until it shifted under their feet. The first trap was simple. He stopped by the office of Mayor Finch with a bundle of old letters under his arm. The mayor had always liked Arthur. Years of polite conversation at community events had earned him trust. Arthur asked casual questions about the upcoming town improvements, listening for the gaps. Mayor Finch smiled too much, spoke in phrases that sounded rehearsed. We're working on a brighter future for our residents, he kept saying, but he never mentioned Silver Creek Holdings. That was the first tell. Meanwhile, Maggie was working her angle. She left a polite voicemail for Carl Diensmore's office. Posing as a historian researching the town's industrial past, she asked about environmental cleanup permits, hoping curiosity would draw a reaction. Within a day, a clerk from the law firm called back, trying too hard to sound uninterested, confirming that paperwork had indeed been filed, though she wouldn't say by whom. Grace stayed late at the library, sifting through digitized newspapers, looking for anything that tied Silver Creek Holdings to previous developments. What she found was telling. In a neighboring county, the company had purchased land through a shell corporation, redeveloped it, and then sold it off to a multinational chain within a year. The pattern was clear. Henry's job was more personal. He started visiting the Veterans Hall more often, nursing a single beer while catching pieces of conversation. Travis's name floated in the air like a bad smell. Apparently, he had been flashing around new money at the pool table, talking about locking things down before the competition wakes up. But Arthur's real stroke came 2 days later, when he intercepted a conversation in the back corner of Miller's diner. He had slipped in quietly for coffee, sitting just close enough to catch Travis talking with a man in a tailored suit. The stranger's briefcase sat on the table, papers neatly stacked. "I told you the holdouts will come around," Travis was saying. "And if they don't, I'll make sure they regret it." The man didn't respond, just nodded, jotting something down. Arthur didn't move, didn't even look directly at them, but when he stood to leave, he made sure to drop a small envelope on the counter in plain view of Travis. The return address was a fake, but the handwriting looked official. It was just bait. Later that afternoon, Arthur saw Travis himself pick it up from the coffee shop counter where Sam had accidentally left it. Travis stuffed it into his jacket without opening it, but his jaw tightened. Arthur smiled to himself on the walk home. The game had begun, and Travis had just taken the first bite. The next morning, the air in town felt charged, as if the autumn wind itself carried secrets. Arthur took his usual walk past the hardware store, the post office, and the small row of law offices above the bakery. On the surface, nothing had changed, but Arthur knew better. When men like Travis were rattled, the ripples reached farther than most people could see. Maggie was the first to notice it. She called Arthur from the council office, speaking in a tone that was almost a whisper. "Travis was here this morning. He didn't have an appointment. He just walked in and demanded to speak with Drew Porter." Closed the door behind them. "I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to know your bait worked," he said, and I quote, "I want to know who's sniffing around my deal." Arthur's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then he's already looking in the wrong direction. Henry had his own sighting later that afternoon. Travis had shown up at the Veterans Hall, playing cards with men he usually avoided. He was buying rounds of beer and telling stories about big changes coming to town. His voice was louder than usual, as if volume could drown out the unease crawling under his skin. Grace's role was less visible, but no less important. She found that Silver Creek Holdings had filed a change of address for their registered agent, not in the papers yet, but quietly logged at the county clerk's office. That kind of move meant they were consolidating their paperwork ahead of a major action. Arthur listened to it all and said very little. His strategy was patience. He wanted Travis to act before his foundation was secure. The man's ego would push him there faster than any direct attack could. That evening, Arthur returned to Miller's diner. He ordered his usual coffee and pie and waited. It didn't take long. Travis walked in, scanning the room like a predator. Searching for prey, his eyes locked on Arthur, and for the first time in a long while, Arthur saw something other than smugness. There was calculation there, and maybe even a hint of respect. Travis slid into the booth across from him without asking. "You've been busy, Hayes," he said, his voice low. Arthur didn't flinch. "I walk the same streets I always have." Travis smirked, but it was thinner than usual. "You're playing some kind of game. I don't know what you think you're going to win, but I'd tread lightly if I were you." Arthur's reply was simple. "I've spent my life walking on ice without falling through." "You might want to watch where you step." Travis leaned back, chuckling, but it didn't reach his eyes. He left without finishing his coffee, but Arthur could tell the man was no longer completely in control of his own tempo. The coffee club would hear about it the next morning, and they'd know what Arthur already did. The first crack had formed in Travis's armor, and cracks had a way of widening fast. Asterisk the coffee club gathered earlier than usual the next morning. The light through the coffee shop windows was pale and cold. Turning the steam from their mugs into slow-moving ghosts, Maggie spread out her notes, Grace stacked her maps, and Henry leaned forward, elbows on the table, waiting for Arthur to speak. "He's unsettled," Arthur said plainly. "I saw it in his eyes last night. That means we press while he's off balance." Maggie tapped her pen. "I think I can get a copy of those closed-door council meeting notes. It won't be official, but I know someone in the clerk's office who owes me a favor," Grace nodded, "and I'll keep looking through the archives for old deeds. If we can prove that any of the land Silver Creek is trying to buy has restrictive covenants, it could tie them up in court for months." Henry grinned. Faintly, "Meanwhile, I'll keep working the Veterans Hall. I've already heard from a couple of guys who said Travis has been promising jobs that don't exist yet. He's overpromising to keep his supporters close." Arthur listened, weighing every word. Then he said, "We need to know his circle. The people who actually make his deals possible. The developers, the lawyers, the ones who keep their names off paper." Grace frowned. "That's not easy to track." Arthur smiled just slightly. "It is if you know where they eat lunch that afternoon." Arthur set his plan in motion. He took a quiet seat at the back of the Milltown Grill, the kind of place where the town's influential men liked to meet because the booths were high and the waitstaff discreet. Sure enough, Travis showed up half an hour later with the man in the tailored suit Arthur had seen before. They were joined by two others, a tall man with the tan lines of a construction helmet and a woman in a sharp, gray business dress who carried herself like she owned the building. Arthur didn't need to hear every word to know what was happening. He caught phrases: Phase 1 purchase, environmental waiver, fast-track permits, the language of a deal already in motion. And when the woman passed a folder to Travis, Arthur caught the name on the corner, Deansmore Legal Group. By the time they left, Arthur had memorized faces, posture, the way each of them deferred to the woman in gray. She was the real power. Travis was just the noise. That night, Arthur shared what he'd learned with the coffee club. Maggie's eyes lit with recognition. "That's Evelyn Sharp. She's been behind every major development project in the county for the last decade. If she's involved, this isn't just a land deal. It's a takeover." Arthur nodded slowly. "Then we'll have to make her think the ground under her feet is just as shaky as Travis's." The coffee club leaned in closer, and in that moment, their quiet little table in the corner felt less like a group of retirees and more like the command post of a campaign that was about to turn personal. Evelyn Sharp was not the type to be rattled by a whisper. She had built her career on walking into small towns, smiling just enough to make you think she cared, and then walking out with deeds and permits signed neatly in her favor. But Arthur knew that every fortress had a weak gate, and Evelyn's was her reputation. She needed the illusion of public goodwill to keep the deals flowing. The coffee club decided to test just how much she valued that image. Maggie started by writing a carefully worded letter to the local newspaper under a pseudonym. It didn't accuse anyone directly, but it asked pointed questions about recent development projects in nearby counties and the mysterious disappearance of several historic buildings. The letter sparked conversations at the diner, the library. Even during Sunday service, Grace followed by quietly organizing a Heritage Committee meeting at the library. She invited shop owners, old families, and anyone with a vested interest in keeping Main Street intact. They discussed preservation grants, historical designations, and how such measures could complicate large-scale redevelopment. Grace didn't say Evelyn's name, but she didn't have to. The undercurrent was clear. Meanwhile, Henry tapped into his network. He arranged for a few veterans to stop by council meetings and ask about the rumors of out-of-state developers. They posed as curious citizens, not opposition, but the effect was immediate. The council members began glancing at each other more often during public sessions. Arthur played the long game. He knew Evelyn Sharp's people would eventually hear about these stirrings, and when they did, they'd have to decide whether to address them or pretend they didn't exist. Either way, cracks would form. A week later, the coffee club got their first sign it was working. Maggie received a call from her contact at the clerk's office. "You didn't hear it from me, but Evelyn Sharp has been making unannounced visits to town hall. She's not smiling as much these days." Arthur leaned back in his chair when he heard. Good. That means she's looking over her shoulder. But they all knew this was just the beginning. People like Evelyn didn't back off. They tightened their grip. The question was, could the coffee club get her to make a mistake before she locked the town into her plan? Arthur's eyes drifted to the door of the coffee shop, as if expecting Travis to swagger in. But this time, he wasn't thinking about the bully. He was thinking about the woman behind him, the one who didn't need to raise her voice to take everything you had. Asterisk, it happened on a Tuesday morning. The sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that made Main Street feel smaller. The coffee club had just settled in when the door to the shop opened, and Evelyn Sharp herself stepped inside. She didn't look like someone passing through. She looked like someone arriving to take inventory. Her charcoal coat was tailored. Her heels clicked with precision on the hardwood floor. Her eyes swept the room without a smile. And then she spotted Arthur. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight over to the corner table. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice smooth but with an edge. "I hear you've been asking questions." Arthur didn't rise, but he did tilt his head slightly. "And I hear you've been giving answers to people who forgot how to ask the right ones, Maggie." Grace and Henry stayed quiet, watching the exchange like it was a chess match. Evelyn pulled out a chair without asking and sat, folding her hands neatly on the table. "I've been in this business a long time," she began. "I know how rumors start, and I know how they get in the way of progress. So let me be clear. My company is here to help this town. Jobs, infrastructure, new opportunities, things you can't get from nostalgia and coffee refills." Arthur's gaze was steady. Funny thing about progress, it doesn't always look like what people were promised. Evelyn leaned forward just a fraction. "I'm not Travis Kane, Mr. Hayes. I don't need to posture or threaten. I work in facts and contracts, and the fact is, this town is one vote away from a future it can't afford to miss." Henry's voice rumbled low. "Or a future it won't recognize when it gets here." Evelyn's eyes flicked to him, then back to Arthur. "I respect your history here, but you and your friends are in the way of something bigger than all of us." Arthur took a slow sip of his coffee, then set the cup down. "Bigger doesn't always mean better, and if you're so certain this is good for the town, why not share the full details with everyone?" No closed doors, no fine print. For the first time, Evelyn's composure wavered, just slightly. It was enough for Maggie to catch, enough for Grace to note in her mind. Evelyn rose, adjusting her coat. "Enjoy your coffee. Mr. Hayes changes. Coming whether you like it or not." As she walked out, the bell above the door jingled softly, but the air she left behind felt heavier. Arthur looked at the others. "Now we know she's rushing the deal. And that means she's worried. The faster she moves, the more likely she slips." And in his mind, Arthur was already placing the next piece on the board, one that would force Evelyn to show her real hand in front of the entire town. Arthur knew that if Evelyn wanted to move fast, she would need to control the story before anyone else could define it for her. That meant public appearances, carefully crafted speeches, and the illusion of complete transparency. It also meant she would be vulnerable if the right question landed at the right time. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The town announced a Future of Main Street Community Forum to be held in the high school gym. Evelyn would be there as the guest speaker, along with Mayor Finch and several council members. The coffee club didn't need to discuss it. They knew this was where the next move would happen. In the days leading up to the forum, Maggie worked her network, quietly spreading the word that anyone concerned about Main Street should attend. She didn't tell them what to say, only that it was worth hearing the answers firsthand. Grace prepared a set of questions, phrased politely, but loaded with specifics. She knew that the more precise the question, the harder it was for someone like Evelyn to hide behind vague promises. Henry made sure a few veterans would be in the crowd, men and women who weren't afraid to speak up. Arthur's role was different. He didn't plan to speak first. He planned to listen, to watch Evelyn control the room, and then to choose the exact moment to step in. That was how you stopped a runaway train. You didn't throw yourself in front of it. You pulled the right lever at the right switch. The night of the forum, the gym smelled faintly of floor wax and popcorn from the concession stand. Folding chairs were set up in neat rows, the basketball scoreboard glowing faintly above the stage. The place was fuller than anyone expected. Word had clearly traveled. Evelyn stood at the podium in a deep blue dress, her voice steady as she painted a picture of prosperity, new jobs, revitalized infrastructure, more visitors to Main Street. She smiled at the applause, kept her answers brief, and never let herself get rattled, until Grace stood, holding a folded copy of an old property deed. "Ms. Sharp, can you explain why Silver Creek Holdings is pursuing land that still carries an unresolved environmental cleanup requirement from the state?" The murmur that rolled through the crowd was immediate. Evelyn's smile stayed in place, but her pause was just a little too long. She answered smoothly, talking about remediation plans and compliance. But the room had shifted. People were now listening for what she wasn't saying. Henry followed with his question. "If these jobs you're promising are real, can you guarantee they'll go to people in this town and not outside contractors?" Evelyn's reply was confident but less crisp. Arthur waited until the question slowed, until Evelyn began to believe she had regained control. Then he stood, his voice carrying without force. "Ms. Sharp, I delivered mail in this town for 40 years. I've seen names on envelopes before they were names on buildings. So maybe you can explain why Silver Creek Holdings has been quietly paying legal fees for Travis Kane since last spring." The silence was absolute. Even the creak of the folding chairs stopped. Evelyn's eyes locked on Arthur, and for the first time, the polish cracked. Evelyn's hands tightened on the edges of the podium, but her voice came out smooth enough to fool anyone who didn't know what to listen for. "Mr. Hayes, I'm not sure where you've gotten your information, but I assure you, my company has no direct business relationship with Mr. Kane." Arthur didn't flinch. "It's not a relationship on paper. It's payments handled through Deansmore Legal Group, same firm representing Silver Creek, same address on the checks. I've seen the envelopes." The crowd stirred, a wave of low murmurs moving through the gym like a wind picking up before a storm. Maggie saw Evelyn glance toward Mayor Finch, and in that split second of hesitation, the air in the room shifted. The certainty in her posture was just a fraction weaker. Grace stood again, her voice calm but clear. "If there's nothing to hide, will you make all contracts and payment records for this project public before the council vote?" Evelyn's smile was tighter now. "Some agreements contain confidential clauses, but we will share all information that is legally permissible." That answer didn't land the way she wanted. Henry leaned back in his chair and said just loud enough for those around him to hear, "That's a nice way of saying no." The whisper spread quickly. Several hands went up in the audience. More questions followed. Some asked about traffic, others about property taxes, but the undertone was the same: doubt. People were no longer looking at Evelyn as the savior of the town. They were looking at her as someone selling them something they might not want. Arthur stayed silent now, his work for the evening already done. The seed was planted. The more Evelyn tried to polish the answers, the more the crowd heard the grinding underneath. By the time the meeting ended, she walked off stage with a polite nod. But there was no warm applause following her. The conversations in the aisles were hushed but sharp. Names like Travis Kane and Silver Creek whispered with suspicion. Outside, the night air was cool and damp. Arthur stepped into the parking lot. With Maggie, Grace, and Henry, none of them smiled, but each carried the quiet satisfaction of a battle that had tilted in their favor. Arthur glanced back toward the gym. "She hit back harder now," he said, "but so will we." And in the shadows at the far end of the lot, Travis Kane leaned against his truck, arms crossed, watching them leave. The look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was the dawning realization that his side might not be untouchable after all. Asterisk, the rain started just after midnight, a slow, steady patter that turned the streets into dark ribbons under the streetlights. Arthur was walking home from Henry's place, collar up against the wind, when he saw a familiar shape leaning on a lamppost at the corner. Travis Kane stepped forward, his boots splashing in a shallow puddle. "You've been busy, Hayes," he said, voice low. Too busy for a man who's supposed to be enjoying his retirement. Arthur didn't slow. "And you've been making a lot of noise for someone who doesn't want people asking questions." Travis moved to block his path, the leather of his jacket gleaming under the light. "Let me make this simple. You stay out of my way, and I'll forget about this little hobby of yours. Keep poking around, and you're going to regret it." Arthur's eyes didn't waver. "I've been delivering news, good and bad, to people for 40 years. You think I'm afraid of someone delivering empty threats?" Travis's smirk faltered, replaced by something sharper. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Arthur stepped closer until they were almost nose to nose. "No, Travis, I know exactly who I'm dealing with. A man who hides behind bigger names because he's afraid to stand alone." For a moment, neither moved. The rain hissed on the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Then Travis stepped back, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Fine, old man, play your game. But remember, I play to win." Arthur walked past him without looking back, but in his mind, he knew what this meant. Travis was no longer just a pawn. He was becoming desperate, and desperation made people sloppy. The next morning, Arthur told the coffee club about the encounter. Henry's expression darkened. "If he's willing to come at you like that in the open, he's not far from making a mistake that'll take him out of the game entirely." Maggie was already flipping through her notes. "Then we need to be ready to catch it when he does." Grace adjusted her glasses. "And we need to make sure Evelyn Sharp is watching him closely, too. The more she doubts him, the more this whole thing unravels." Arthur nodded, the corners of his mouth tightening into something close to a smile. "Then it's time we give her a reason to doubt." Asterisk Arthur's plan was less about catching Travis, red-handed, and more about making Evelyn believe he might already be caught. If doubt could be planted between them, the alliance would strain under its own weight. He began with something simple, information that was true enough to be dangerous, but vague enough to look like a leak. Maggie crafted a short, anonymous note on plain stationery. It read, "Ask Travis who he told about the environmental report, and why they know about the Deansmore checks." No names, no signature, just enough to set a fuse. Grace handled the delivery, slipping the note into the incoming mail for the law office that handled Evelyn's contracts. She knew they'd forward it immediately. Evelyn would see it within a day. Meanwhile, Henry kept ears open at the Veterans Hall. It didn't take long before he heard someone mention that Travis had been in a foul mood, snapping at people, cutting games short. He was carrying his phone around like it might explode in his hand. 2 days later, Evelyn made her move. She arrived at the Milltown Grill alone. No entourage, no Travis. Arthur happened to be sitting at the counter, not by accident, when she slid into a booth in the corner. He watched as Travis arrived minutes later, looking unsettled. The conversation was low, but Arthur knew the signs. Evelyn leaning forward, Travis talking fast, hands moving more than usual. Her eyes narrowed once, twice, and she sat back, lips pressed in a thin line. When Travis finally left, he didn't head to his truck. He walked instead toward the alley, lit a cigarette, and stared at nothing for a long minute before storming off. Arthur finished his coffee, knowing the seed had taken root. Evelyn might not cut Travis loose yet, but the suspicion was there now, and suspicion had a way of making allies watch each other more closely than they watched their enemies. That night at the coffee club's table, Arthur explained what he'd seen. If she's questioning him, she's distracted, and the more distracted she is, the more likely she'll miss the move that actually matters. Maggie's eyes sharpened. So what's the real move? Arthur leaned in, lowering his voice. We make the town's history the one thing she can't work around. Grace was the first to point out that the rail spur and part of the Miller estate were old enough and unique enough to qualify for a state historical designation. If they could get that designation in motion fast, it would lock the property into a preservation process, slowing Evelyn's project to a crawl. Maggie volunteered to handle the paperwork. Her years as a schoolteacher had made her meticulous with forms, and she knew exactly how to make the case compelling. She gathered photographs, historical documents, even handwritten accounts from families who had lived there for generations. Henry began calling in favors. Veterans who had once shipped goods to the rail spur during peacetime, farmers whose crops had been loaded there decades ago. Each story added weight to the argument that this wasn't just land. It was part of the town's living memory. Arthur's job was timing. He knew if Evelyn got wind of the application too early, she'd find a way to block it before it was official. So he waited until Maggie had the forms ready, until Grace had lined up key community supporters, and until Henry had gathered a small army of locals willing to sign petitions. Then, on a crisp Thursday morning, Arthur walked those papers into the State Preservation Office himself. The clerk stamped them, gave him a receipt, and told him the review process would begin immediately. That stamp was all Arthur needed. Once the application was in, the land was flagged in the public registry. The news spread within hours, not through the newspapers or official channels, but through the same small-town veins that carried gossip faster than a radio signal. Shopkeepers mentioned it to customers. Churchgoers whispered about it over coffee. And by evening, Evelyn Sharp knew exactly what had happened. She called a special meeting at Town Hall for the next day. The coffee club attended, sitting together in their usual quiet row. Evelyn spoke sharply, dressed in all black, her tone less polished than before. She called the move a misguided attempt to stall progress and an unnecessary obstacle. Arthur didn't rise to argue. He simply sat, calm as stone, knowing that every word she spoke in frustration made her look less like a leader and more like someone fighting for her own benefit. When the meeting ended, Maggie whispered to the others, "We've got her off balance again." Arthur nodded once, his eyes fixed on the exit where Evelyn had left in a hurry. And the game's not over yet. It didn't take long for Evelyn to make her counterplay. She knew she couldn't officially interfere with the historical application without drawing more public scrutiny, but she had another option. Travis, 2 days after the preservation papers went in, the chairwoman of the historical committee, a quiet widow named Lillian Moore, received an unexpected visitor. Travis showed up at her front porch with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. He claimed he just wanted to talk things over. But Lillian later told Maggie his tone was more warning than conversation. "He kept saying I'd be better off staying out of it," Lillian said, her voice trembling over the phone. "Said things could get complicated for people who stick there. Knows where it doesn't belong." The coffee club gathered at their table that same afternoon. Maggie relayed the story. Grace's hands tightened around her tea. "He's trying to scare her into withdrawing support." Henry's jaw flexed. "It's the same play he's always used. Lean on people until they give way." Arthur was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Then we make sure Lillian doesn't stand alone." They acted quickly, Henry visited Lillian that evening with 2 other veterans. Sitting in her living room while she told the story again, Maggie wrote a short, careful statement for her, explaining why the preservation mattered and why she wouldn't be intimidated. Grace made copies for distribution at the library. Arthur paid a different visit to the porch where Travis liked to sit outside the pool hall. He didn't raise his voice, didn't threaten, just stood there and said, "The thing about trying to scare people, Travis, is that when they realize they're not alone, you're the one who ends up looking small." Travis stared at him, but Arthur held his gaze until the younger man looked away, flicking his cigarette into the gutter. The next day, Lillian walked into the coffee shop. Not shaking anymore, she placed a folder of photographs and letters on the coffee club's table. "If they want to fight, let's give them one worth having." Arthur smiled faintly. "Now we're talking." It happened on a Friday night. The kind of night when Main Street was quiet enough for you to hear the hum of the street lamps. Travis had been drinking at the pool hall, his voice carrying through the open door as Arthur walked past on his way home. Arthur didn't plan to stop, but then he caught the words, "I'll make sure those old fools wish they'd kept their mouths shut," followed by laughter that didn't sound like a joke. Inside, Travis was leaning over the bar, talking to the man in the construction helmet Arthur had seen with Evelyn at the Milltown Grill. In front of them, spread out like cards, were aerial photos of the Miller estate and the rail spur. Some had red X's drawn across them. Others had notes in thick marker. Arthur stayed in the doorway just long enough to see Travis tap one of the photos. "We start clearing here first. Nobody's going to stop us once the equipment rolls in." That was his mistake, speaking too freely in a room where not everyone was a friend. Because in the far corner, a man named Pete Wallace, who ran the hardware store and had known Arthur for decades, was nursing a beer. Pete caught Arthur's eye, then looked down at the photos with a frown. Arthur left without saying a word, but by the next morning, Pete had stopped by the coffee shop, a folded napkin in his pocket. On it, he'd scribbled notes about what he'd overheard, dates, equipment orders, and the name of a subcontractor out of state. "This is enough to raise hell," Henry said, scanning the napkin. "If we get this to the right ears, they'll have to investigate before a single tree comes down." Arthur nodded. "Not just the right ears, the loudest ones, the kind that make politicians nervous." Grace was already thinking ahead. "We can take it to the State Preservation Board and the local paper on the same day. That way, Evelyn can't smother it before it spreads." Maggie tapped the table thoughtfully. "And we'll do it without our names on it. Let them wonder who's feeding the fire." Arthur looked at each of them, his voice low but certain. "This is the move we've been waiting for. Once this is out, the cracks we've made turn into fractures." And somewhere across town, Travis Kane had no idea that his careless bragging had just handed the coffee club the tool they needed to break the whole deal apart. They moved quickly, timing everything so there was no gap for Evelyn or Travis to respond. Grace typed up a clean, anonymous letter to the editor of the local paper, attaching copies of Pete Wallace's notes and a rough description of the aerial photos. She kept it factual, no accusations, just the kind of detailed information that demanded an explanation. Maggie slipped an identical packet into an envelope for the State Preservation Board, adding a cover page that stressed the urgency of protecting the contested land before irreversible damage occurred. She didn't sign it, but she made sure it looked like it had come from someone with inside knowledge. Henry delivered the packet to the newspaper just after dawn, handing it to a young reporter who looked like she'd been waiting her whole career for a scoop this big. She promised to verify and run with it within the day. Arthur didn't deliver anything himself. He knew his part was to stay visible in town, going about his business as if nothing unusual was happening, so no one would connect the dots too quickly. By sunset, the first ripples began to hit. The online edition of the paper ran a headline that made everyone sit up straighter. Questions raised over development deal. Photos suggest early site plans already underway. The article quoted unnamed sources about potential environmental violations and contracts signed before council approval. At the same time, the State Preservation Board acknowledged receipt of new evidence in their review, halting any permits connected to the contested parcels until further investigation. That one sentence, buried halfway down a formal statement, was enough to throw Evelyn's schedule into chaos. The next morning, the coffee shop was buzzing. Shop owners were clustered at tables, talking in low, sharp tones. People who had been indifferent now wanted details. They wanted to know who was behind the development and why things were moving so quietly. Arthur listened, sipping his coffee, not saying a word. He didn't need to. The work was all ready. Done, the town's trust in Evelyn Sharp had been bruised at the forum. But now it was bleeding openly, and with every whispered question, her grip loosened. Henry leaned toward Arthur, voice low. "She's gonna come after someone for this leak, Arthur." Nodded, eyes on the door. "Let's hope she looks in the wrong direction." And just as he said it, the bell above the door jingled. And Evelyn Sharp stepped in, her gaze sharper than the autumn wind outside. Evelyn Sharp didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked straight to the coffee club's table, her heels striking the floor like a countdown. She didn't ask. To sit, she didn't smile. She just placed a folded newspaper down between Arthur and Maggie. The headline glared up at them. "I suppose I should congratulate you," she said, her voice low but cutting. "You've managed to turn a clean deal into a circus." Arthur didn't look at the paper. If it was clean, it wouldn't fall apart this easily. Her eyes narrowed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've put this town's future in jeopardy. You think the people stirring you up care about preserving Main Street. They care about their bottom line, same as anyone else." Maggie met her gaze evenly. "At least we're not selling the whole thing off before people understand what they're losing." Evelyn leaned closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Travis is unpredictable when he's cornered, and thanks to this little stunt, he's very much in a corner now." Arthur's reply was calm, almost gentle. "Then maybe you should worry less about us and more about the company you keep." For a moment, Evelyn's composure wavered, but she caught herself quickly. She straightened, gathered the paper, and said, "Enjoy your victory lap, Mr. Hayes. It won't last." Then she turned on her heel and left, the bell above the door chiming behind her. The coffee club sat in silence for a few seconds before Henry finally spoke. "She's bluffing. That wasn't confidence. That was someone buying time." Arthur nodded. "And time's the one thing she's running out of." Outside, the wind had picked up, blowing leaves across the street like a warning. Somewhere out there, Travis was hearing from Evelyn, and Arthur knew the next move wouldn't be subtle. It would be loud, messy, and exactly the kind of mistake they could use to finish this. It happened 2 days later, just after the morning rush. The coffee club was in their usual corner when the door slammed open so hard the bell above it clanged wildly. Travis Kane stormed in, his jacket unzipped, his face flushed with anger. He didn't head for the counter. He came straight toward their table, ignoring the quiet hush that fell over the shop. Every pair of eyes turned toward him. "You think you've won?" he shouted, his voice cracking the stillness. "You think some old stories and a bunch of dusty pictures are going to stop what's coming? I've got contracts, I've got deals, and I've got people who owe me favors." Arthur didn't rise, didn't even flinch. His voice was steady. "You've got nothing if the people you work for decide you're more trouble than you're worth." Travis's jaw worked, his hands curling into fists. "You think Evelyn's going to drop me? She needs me. I'm the one who—" He stopped himself, but it was too late. Henry leaned forward, his tone sharp. "The one who what, Travis?" "Who passed her the aerial photos before the council vote. Who leaned on people like Lillian Moore to back out." Who took her money to grease the right palms? The crowd murmured, people exchanging glances. Someone near the counter pulled out their phone and started recording. Travis's eyes darted around, realizing too late that he'd walked himself into a trap. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but the words lacked conviction. Arthur finally stood, meeting him eye to eye. I've walked this town longer than you've been alive. I know its streets, its people, and its history. And I know a bully when I see one. The thing about bullies, Travis, is they always talk too much when they think they're in control. The silence that followed was heavy, then broken by Sam the barista's voice from behind the counter. You should leave, Travis. Travis looked at Arthur one last time, but whatever fight was in him had drained away. He turned and walked out, the door swinging shut behind him. Within a week, word spread that Evelyn Sharp had withdrawn her bid, citing unforeseen community challenges. The Preservation Board moved forward with the historical designation. Locking the land in place, the coffee club didn't celebrate with speeches or champagne. They just gathered at their table, like always, mugs in hand, the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd done right by their town hanging in the air. Arthur sipped his coffee, glancing at the door where Travis had once stood. Funny thing about strings, he said softly. They break when you pull too hard. And this time, the whole table smiled.